You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
We have a commemoration today, which means great history lesson.
Yes.
I'm super excited about this.
Me too.
Thanks to Concordia University, Wisconsin for supporting The Coffee Hour. Find out more about Concordia University, Wisconsin at cuw.edu.
Live uncommon.
Joining us today, the Reverend Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Dr. MacKenzie, welcome back to The Coffee Hour.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I always have a good time when I'm talking with you folks, so thanks.
As do we. We
Yes.
always just have a blast learning so much, particularly the great history of the Reformation. So today the church commemorates Frederick the Wise. Who was Frederick the Wise, or I believe also Frederick III, Elector of Saxony?
That's correct, too. Sure. Well, Frederick was the political figure in that part of Germany at the time who was most responsible for seeing to it that Luther taught theology at the University of Wittenberg, and that when Luther initiated what we call today the Reformation, that he was able to do it. Frederick was really Luther's protector in those early years of the Reformation, so that it is not at all an exaggeration to say that if it had not been for Frederick the Wise, there would not have been Martin Luther and his Reformation. He's that important.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to talk about him in particular. So often we focus in on the more religious, the theologians of the Reformation, and we kind of breeze past Frederick the Wise as an important character. But yeah, his role in this Reformation was so incredibly important. Now, Indy mentioned that his title was Elector of Saxony. What was that role of an elector in this time period in Germany?
Yeah, great question. I hope I can answer it briefly as well as clearly. The part of Europe that we think of today as Germany was in those years the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire, but that was its name. And it was a form of government in which authority was distributed at many different levels. Not a democratic form of government, but a government which you had emperor, kings, dukes, counts, etc. Well, one of the more important of those figures inferior to the emperor was anybody who was called an elector, because when the imperial throne fell vacant, they chose a new one. But it wasn't an election by all the people or even by all the nobility. It was an election by 7 men. And one of those men was Frederick, who was himself the ruler of that part of Germany, which they called, I think we still call today, Saxony. So he's a territorial ruler, but a very important one, because he will help to choose the next emperor when the old one dies.
So what were his, Frederick the Wise's convictions or beliefs?
Well, Frederick was a very pious Roman Catholic. The best illustration of that was his devotion to the saints and collecting their relics. In late medieval Catholicism, the cult of the saints was very strong, and that just simply means that the church recognized that there were particular individuals who had made it to heaven, weren't in purgatory, whom people could call upon for help in all kinds of troubles and situations. It was more difficult for people to pray to God or Jesus Christ because of their elevated status. They were God. They were transcendent. They were way above ordinary mortals. And it was easier for them to pray to people who had been like them but had made it into heaven. So they prayed to the saint. Your prayer to a saint would be more effective if you prayed it close to one of those saints' relics. And that meant body parts or clothing or things closely associated with the saint during his life. So the idea was, if you wanted help from, let's say, St. Bartholomew for skin disease, and he had been martyred by having his pulled off, want to say a prayer to St. Bartholomew near like a piece of his skin, a relic, and then St. Bartholomew was more likely to hear you and to help you. Well, Frederick went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and in the wake of that pilgrimage, he began collecting these relics and had a collection of over 19,000 relics in the castle church, on the door of which Luther had posted his 95 Theses. So Frederick was strongly committed to the Christian religion as he had learned it, but it was in this late medieval form in which there were a lot of things which were not biblical and against which Luther would preach, and finally which the Lutheran Church would eliminate.
So in his role as an elector and also with his own beliefs, what was his relationship like with the Pope at that time?
That's a good question. Popes at this time were thought of not just as or merely religious leaders, but also political leaders. And they were heavily invested in European politics, and most particularly in Italian politics. So Frederick's relationship with the Pope was good, but if political interests diverged, then they could have a falling out as well. Now, I'll just mention one little episode that illustrates the closeness, or could be closeness. This was when the old emperor died. This was Maximilian I. He died early in 1519. They had to choose a new one. Frederick was one of the 7 who would get to choose. And the Pope was very much interested in who the next emperor would be. He didn't want an emperor who was going to give him, the Pope, too much trouble, especially in terms of Italian political interests. So at that point, the Pope really made an effort to cultivate Frederick the Wise, even sent a special papal gift. It was called the Golden Rose, and it had indulgences attached to it, and was given to laymen who were especially important. And so the Pope sent one in order basically to get Frederick's vote when it came to electing the new emperor. So at that point, the two were very close. On the other hand, when Frederick persisted in protecting Martin Luther, then the Pope threatened Frederick, even with, at one point, putting Saxony under the interdict, which would have meant suspending all religious services and the like. So depending on the question, Frederick and the Pope could be in good relations or in bad relations. And of course, the Reformation really threatened that relation permanently, although Frederick still died a Catholic, I guess we'd say, but I mean, he wasn't excommunicated.
So what was the relationship then of Frederick the Wise to Luther? Did their paths cross?
That too is a good question. As far as we know, Luther saw Frederick the Wise only once, and that was at the Diet of Worms. That was the only time that Luther ever saw Frederick. So several years ago, there was a movie version of Luther's life, and it shows Frederick and Luther talking to one another, especially about the first translation of the Bible into German. Well, that never happened. This was a hierarchical society, and people in the class of Frederick did not chum around with people in the social class of Luther. So they really didn't have a personal connection that way. But Luther and Frederick did communicate, especially through letters, although, again, it was kind of indirect. Luther corresponded a great deal with Frederick's chaplain, secretary, and advisor, a man by the name of George Spalatin. So there was communication back and forth, but it was almost always through that intermediary. So they didn't have a personal relationship, but they did have a professional relationship in that Frederick was the man who actually had found the University of Wittenberg. And so he maintained, and that was just in 1502, Luther joined the faculty in 1512, just 10 years after its founding, and Frederick maintained a personal interest financially and also in terms of management and personnel of the university. It's not that Frederick kind of ran everything, but he continued to be engaged with the university and was worked for its success and tried to bring in the best kind of faculty and the like. So there was a kind of professional relationship between the two men, if not a personal one.
Thank you for referencing the film, the Luther film from the early 2000s. I think it was 2003. That was what I was picturing in my mind, and I was wondering if that was accurate. Now, Dr. MacKenzie, I just want to sit down and watch that movie with you and have you point out this happened, this didn't happen.
Annotated version of the movie. I would love that.
No, you really wouldn't, because as my wife will tell you, and I think this is true of most historians, we only enjoy movie versions of that form of history that we don't know anything about. Because if we know something about it, we're likely just to kind of be fidgety and say, well, that really didn't, So I don't really think you want to watch that movie with me.
Fair enough.
I can understand that.
That makes sense. We are taking a look at the history of Frederick the Wise, or Frederick III, Elector of Saxony, today with Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of Historical Theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We'll continue the conversation in just a moment, right here on the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
At Concordia University, Wisconsin, we believe you were created for a reason: to use your God-given gifts to help others, to live a life of self-sacrifice in a me-first world, to live a life that's uncommon. Whether you're taking one of 50-plus online programs or learning with us in person on the shores of Lake Michigan, you'll be equipped to make an uncommon impact. Learn more at cuw.edu. Concordia University, Wisconsin. Live uncommon.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
Today, the church commemorates Frederick the Wise. We're talking with Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of historical theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So we just embarked on the relationship between Martin Luther and Frederick the Wise, which we realize, as you pointed out, there wasn't like a very personal relationship, but rather the role of Frederick the Wise was really, in a sense, as elector, he was protector of Martin Luther. And so while they didn't really interact personally, he still carried out his vocation, even though it sounds like Frederick the Wise was still a Roman Catholic throughout much of this, right?
Yeah, this is an interesting question that we can't really answer definitively. Clearly, Frederick the Wise comes to understand that Luther's theology is significantly different from the religion in which he had been trained. And it does seem that he was, there were just times when he says things like, this is not a matter for human beings. This is a matter that God is in control. And after Luther's confession at the Diet of Worms, Frederick says to Spalatin reports this, Frederick says, Father Martin spoke very well before the emperor and the estates, but he was much too bold for me. So, it's an acknowledgement that there's something there in Luther and what he's saying that Frederick finds attractive and moving. Let me give you another instance of this. This is right when Luther is going to be, in 1518, just about a year after the 95 Theses, Luther has already been accused of heresy, and he's been summoned to Rome. Frederick won't send him to Rome, and he arranges for Luther to have a hearing by the Pope's representative, who is in Germany for one of those meetings of the empire called Diet, this one held in Augsburg. And Luther goes. The Pope's representative doesn't like what he hears from Luther. Luther leaves. The Pope's representative sends a letter to Frederick saying, you've got to turn him over. He's a heretic. We've got to send him to Rome. Frederick ends up refusing, but in the process of his refusing, again, he says not only did Luther not get a fair trial, but also he compliments or says good things about what Luther is saying and teaching. So it's clear that he's maybe not in this all the way in terms of understanding Luther and embracing everything that Luther teaches. But nonetheless, he has a sense that Luther is a man of God, speaking faithfully from the scriptures. And so that's a part of why he wants to defend Luther, not just because he's a professor, but also he's a professor who seems to be on the right side of things.
What kind of risk was this to Frederick the Wise to be standing up so staunchly against all of these demands from other political leaders? What was he risking a lot for himself and his own personal safety and his own political power?
Yes, but also no. He's called wise, and he was actually called wise during his own lifetime because he was politically smart. So he keeps a distance from Luther so that nobody can say he's a Lutheran. Asks for time and delay, gives reasons why he's not turning Luther over. And really, up until the Diet of Worms, his reasoning was that actually the new emperor had guaranteed that any German, any member of the empire, would receive a trial at the hands of fellow Germans. So he doesn't say, oh, Luther is great. He's just saying he's not being treated favorably. And one of the things that he worked for a long time was to see if Luther couldn't get a trial in Germany by German church officials. That never really happened. But as long as Frederick is kind of taking that line, there may be threats, but it'd be hard to convict Frederick of being anything other than kind of good German territorial ruler, not trying to absolutely defy authority, but just to make sure that the authorities were treating his university professor in a fair and just way. So as long as he's kind of politically smart, he's probably okay. Now, after the Diet of Worms, that changes a little bit. But the first thing he does, if you think about it, again, this is how wise he is. As soon as Luther is into Saxon territory, he has Luther kidnapped. He doesn't know the details. He doesn't know where they're going to put him. It's his agents who are doing it, but he can write fairly, I don't know where Luther is. And he did. Also, that gives him some time to think about what he's going to do subsequently. The Diet had condemned Luther as an outlaw, but now he's kidnapped, and so Frederick can't enforce anything against Luther. He doesn't know where Luther is. He has no control over Luther. He might be dead for all Frederick knows. And so they give time to think and to cut political deals with the emperor. And incidentally, the emperor has to leave Germany eventually, and then that means German princes will be more important with an emperor gone and so forth. So Frederick's political smarts really preserve him from excessive hostility from the emperor and the emperor's kind of Catholic supporters within the empire.
How might Luther or the Reformation looked different without this work of Frederick the Wise?
Well, let me see how the best way to answer that. First of all, we all believe that these things happen according to God's providence. So if Frederick hadn't been there and God wanted Luther to succeed in his Reformation, somebody else might have filled in the gap. And as a matter of fact, Frederick's successor was his brother, and he's known in the history books as John the Constant or John the Steadfast. And he was even more of a supporter of Luther's theology than was Frederick. So he might have done something similar. However, just humanly speaking, we can say that if Frederick had not moved early to protect Luther, Luther might very well have been condemned as a heretic and taken off to prison or burned at the stake or some other way silenced, and we would never know him as anything more than a footnote in the history books. So because of Frederick's early and persistent activity to protect Luther, after Luther got into trouble, and as I say, that was within a year after the 95 Theses, if Frederick hadn't done that, history for Martin Luther could have been very significantly different.
Mm-hmm. What kind of effect did all of the this theology, all of Martin Luther's teaching, what kind of effect did that have on Frederick near the end of his life?
Yeah, that's a good question. After Luther returns from the Wartburg and begins to implement Reformation, there are two things that Frederick's heavily engaged with that cause Luther some problems. One was that collection of relics. 19,000 relics in the castle church that went on display a couple of times a year, and to these were attached all kinds of indulgences, time off from purgatory, and all that kind of stuff. Luther said, these things have to go. Frederick got that message, and in 1520, even before the Diet of Worms, he quit buying more of these relics. Okay. Then in 1523, after the return from the Wartburg, Frederick agrees that they will no longer be put on display, with the exception just a few relics that were put on the high altar once a year. So all of that display stuff, all of that public indulgences, etc., that kind of goes away. But Frederick does not get rid of the collection. It's only after he's dead and his brother becomes elector that the relics are disposed of, and I'm not exactly even sure how they did that, but nonetheless, it's the brother who does it. The other thing that was of so much concern to Luther at the castle church was the sacrifice of the Mass. The castle church, Luther even called it the house of idolatry. They had 81 people, 20 altars, and they were doing almost, I think it's like 9,000 to 10,000 masses every year. And these were thought of as sacrifices for sins of the living and of the dead. Jesus had done something, but the priests had to keep doing it, and you keep doing it for people even who were in purgatory. Nobody's going to communion, but these sacrifices are taking place. Luther complains about this. 1523, he appeals to the elector to end this. The elector doesn't do it. He refuses to do it. Luther continues this kind of appeal to the elector, end this abuse at the castle church. The elector refuses to end it. Finally, when Frederick is just a few months before his death, it's the town council of Wittenberg that finally brings this to an end. So you wonder, had Frederick learned anything from Luther's theology? Well, the answer is yes. At the end of his life, when Luther is in Wittenberg implementing a German worship service, on Palm Sunday of 1525, Frederick heard the gospel lessons read in the German language for the very first time in his life. And then on Easter Sunday of 1525, he heard the words of institution in the German language for the very first time in his life. And then on May 5th, the day of his death, he received the Lord's Supper and the consecrated wine as well as the consecrated bread. That was for the first time in his life. And that act, as much as anything else, indicates a Lutheran ethos finally, because it's the Lutherans who implemented communion in both kinds, and the Catholics had always resisted.
What in a sense, a bold confession on his last day on earth.
Yeah,
wow.
On his deathbed, right.
Dr. Cameron MacKenzie, professor of historical theology at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, giving us a wonderful history of Frederick the Wise. Dr. MacKenzie, thank you so much for being our guest on the Coffee Hour today.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@KFUO.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.